This video is sponsored by Battleaxe. Rubberhose 3 is one of the simplest ways to rig up a character in After Effects, and in this video, I'm gonna show you how to use the RubberRig system to create a raster-based character rig. I'll walk you through my entire process from artwork setup, getting things in After Effects, prepping layers for rigging, how to rig with RubberRig, adding custom controls, and cleaning up all the layers so that by the end of it all, we'll have a simple set of controls for animating our character. But first, if you didn't know, there's a Jake in Motion Discord server. We recently crossed the 2,000 member milestone. There are a ton of amazing people in there. I'm in there all the time. It's free to join, so click the link down below and come say hi. Now let's take a look at this artwork in Photoshop. Now this is the character art that I'm going to be working with. You can download this yourself, just follow the link down in the description, but basically it's a cut and paste style, kind of this mixed media look. It's very loose. I'm not very concerned with precision at all on this character rig. Normally I would be, but in this case, it really doesn't matter because it is such a loose style. What is important though is that I split every single layer into its own layer and I labeled them all very clearly. I also want to point out that I chopped off the top half of the shoulder on both arms, basically right where the rotation would happen, and that will make more sense why I did that once we actually go to rig it, but just take note of that. I did that for both arms. I also cut the boot into a few different layers so that this doesn't rotate with the bottom portion of the boot, and I separated out the toes on each shoe just so I had the option to add in some foot roll. So that's about it for Photoshop. That's how I've prepped this artwork. Let's jump now into After Effects and go ahead and import that PSD. Now on import, I want to make sure that the import kind is set to composition, retain layer sizes. That's very important. Click OK, and we're gonna get a composition the same dimensions as what we had inside of Photoshop. All of the layers are exactly the same. I just wanna make sure that I'm working at the frame rate that I actually want, which is 24 frames per second. And I wanna make sure that my duration is set to something big. I generally default this to 1 minute for character work. In case I ever need to animate for longer than 15 or 30 seconds, I have all of that time. So make sure you do that at this point. And then I wanna do a little bit of organization. I like to work with backups in After Effects with character rigs, so I'm going to change the name of this to character artwork. And let's put a 1 right at the beginning of this so it stays at the top. And then I'll go ahead and duplicate this and I'll call this to character and we'll say parenting, and you'll see why in just a second. But before we go there, let's make a folder. We'll call this character comps, and I'll move those two inside, and I'll make another folder called assets and move the layers inside there. Now let's open up that parenting comp. I'll just close out the artwork, but now I have that as a backup as it was imported if I ever need to get back to it. Also make sure that you're saving your projects often early so that you don't have any issues if After Effects crashes. All right, so the first step of this rigging process is going to be just moving anchor points and parenting layers. So let's start with the head. We'll start at the top and work our way down. I'm gonna switch to my anchor point tool with Y on the keyboard and move the anchor point down to about where I want the head to rotate from. And if I switch to my rotation key with W on the keyboard, I can see what that looks like. I might tuck this down into the collar just a little bit more, and that looks pretty good. So that's good for the head. Let's move on to something a little more complicated. We'll say this arm, and I'll just solo these layers so we can focus on just those. So the upper arm, that needs to rotate right about there where the seam is on the jean jacket. So I'm gonna move that up there and check the rotation. Don't worry about the shoulder right now, but that looks good. Let's move on to the lower arm. Now I'm gonna change the blend mode of the upper layer since it's on top to difference, and that's going to make the overlapping pixels black because they're exactly the same from one layer to the other. And again, this normally on maybe an illustrated character or a vector character should be perfectly circular, and that would allow me to know exactly where to put my anchor point so that when this rotates, there will be no jutting out at the elbow here. But again, this is a very loose style. I'm not really concerned with precision, so I'm just gonna roughly put that where I want it, change the blend mode back to normal, and we'll move on to the hand. I want that to rotate right about there. And just like that, I've got my anchor point set up for that arm. Now I just want to parent these layers in order. This is a parenting chain. So the hand goes to the arm lower goes to the arm upper. We don't need to worry about the shoulder yet, but if I just expose the rotation property by pressing R on the keyboard for those 3 layers, I can select all 3 and kind of rotate this around. And you see that I almost have a rig going on just with rotation. It's very rudimentary. This is just a parent chain, but this is the basics of what Rubberhose needs in order to create a rubber rig, but we'll get to there in just a second. Next, I'm just gonna move through all of my artwork, adjust the anchor points and parent layers where they should be. And I should point out on this leg that this part of the boot, I'm not gonna parent it to the artwork yet. That will come in just a little bit. It'll make sense, but for now, just leave it unparented. Okay, I'm gonna leave all of the other layers unparented at this point, and I'm gonna go ahead and duplicate my comp one more time, and I'll call this 3 character rig and open that up. But this way, again, I have a state of this artwork prior to rigging, but with the anchor points and the parenting set up for what's going to be rigged. And this is just as a backup in case I get to a point once the rig is built and I'm like, oh, I need to go back. In this way, I don't have to rebuild a bunch of stuff or remove expressions or do anything like that. I just have that as a backup. So in the character rig comp, we can move on to rigging up one of these arms. So let's start with the one that's on top, the left arm here. Again, I'll just solo those layers, and all I have to do, since my parenting is already set up, is grab the last layer in the parent chain. In this case, it's the hand, and then come over to Rubberhose 3 and click on the new RubberRig button. When I do that, Rubberhose is going to ask me, what do I want to call this limb, and what do I want to label the controllers? So this is the character's left arm. So I'm gonna say L arm, and I'm gonna use the shoulder and wrist controller labels and click OK. Rubberhose is gonna do its thing, and immediately we have this little rig going on. Very similar to an IK rig, not exactly the same, but it's already working for us. I can do things like rotate the controller on the end to move the hand around. The shoulder cap is not moving with it, but we'll address that in just a second. I'm gonna move that down below the controller layers, and I just wanna point out one thing before we get to the shoulder. So let's go over to the Rubberhose panel. I'm actually just gonna close properties so it doesn't keep bringing itself up there. And what I wanna do is go into the settings tab, and down here you'll see this checkbox right here called simple bend. This is on for me, I've checked it on, but what it does is basically simplifies the rig a little bit in exchange for better performance in After Effects. It uses less expressions, it's just lighter weight, but it gives you a little fewer controls. So over here on the Rubberhose bend effect, there's this slide property. This value is calculated by Rubberhose based on where the anchor points of the parent chain layers live. But in this case, it doesn't really do anything if I change it because I have simple bend applied. But if I uncheck this box and apply that setting, then if I bend the arm and I move this slide around, you can see that it actually shifts where that bend is. Now, again, this artwork is very loose. I'm not that concerned with precision. With simple bend on, it's going to place that bend right at 50%. It does modify my artwork a little bit, but I really don't care. The trade-off for me is totally worth it because I don't really care about how precise this artwork is, and it makes the character rig perform much more quick in After Effects. I don't think it's ever gonna get to real time, that's an After Effects problem, but it does speed things up, and you can always re-enable that setting. It's very non-destructive, so don't be afraid to use it and see how it works. Now we've got our arm rigged up. Let's take a look at the shoulder. The way that I'm going to attach this to the limb is not through parenting. And actually, let's go ahead and parent it to, say, the shoulder controller, and I'll show you why this is not a good idea. First of all, it's not going to rotate. That controller doesn't rotate with the artwork. So let's undo and actually unparent that and parent it instead to the left arm upper. Now, this is basically the same as if that part of the artwork was on the same layer as the arm. And what that means is when I stretch my limb, it's going to stretch in the opposite direction because the controller is aligned to the anchor point. Everything is going to stretch off of that point. This is exactly why I separated it so it doesn't have that stretching when I extend my limb. You see how the hand isn't stretching? I want that same behavior on the shoulder cap. So to do that, I'm again going to undo before that shoulder is parented and instead go over to the Manage section of Rubberhose and click on the Parent to Hose button. Since I only had one hose in my composition, it knew which one to apply this to, but my shoulder cap is now down at the wrist. But there's this parent to hose effect that allows me to slide it around based on a percentage value. So 0% is the start of the hose, 100% is the end of the hose. So I'm gonna move this all the way back to 0%, zoom in here, and it's not quite aligned. So what I need to do is just rotate it back into place, and I'm gonna grab my anchor point tool and grab that anchor point, and you see that that's actually just gonna shift the layer around. It's not moving the anchor point, and I'm just gonna have that fit right about there. I think that's actually pretty accurate. And now if I extend my arm, you can see that it's not going to stretch out in the opposite direction. We do see a little gap here, so if I really overextend this, I might need to make some adjustments to the position again of that shoulder cap. But for basic stuff, I think this is gonna work out just fine. Now I'm gonna repeat this process for the rest of the character rig, and I'll stop when there are certain things that I think you should be aware of. Now in the case of this boot, I actually don't need to use parent hose to get this attached to the limb because I want this to stretch with the rest of the artwork. If it was parented to hose using this feature, there will be no stretching or deformations at all. It just attaches it to a point on the limb. So what I want to do in this case is just parent this to the lower leg artwork. And now if I move this around, you see that it moves with it, it stretches. And the toes, I can also just parent that to the foot layer that I have here. And since that doesn't stretch, it's just going to use the traditional parenting process to adopt the transformations of that parent layer, and no stretching is going to be applied. Now on this leg, I get a pretty big jut out on the knee here, and I would like to correct that. Fortunately, this is something that you can do with a RubberRig system because it's just attaching these limbs to an underlying hose that's actually just being hidden. So what I can do is move this layer around however I want, and it's going to still rotate from the same point. So if I just move it down a little bit, let's see what happens there. In fact, I can even do it from this bent angle. Really, what I think the issue is this layer is stretching out too much. So I'm just gonna grab the scale and kind of change this a little bit just so it lines up with the knee joint a little bit more. What probably happened is that the slide value is not close to 50%, and sure enough, there it is, slide, it's at 40%. So that's a 10% difference of the simple bend versus the actual calculated center point for that anchor, and that's probably why it was so off. But that is totally correctable just by adjusting that layer's position, scale, maybe a little bit of rotation, and I think that's gonna work out. Now from here, I've done all of the rigging for all 4 limbs. What I wanna do now is just make sure all of the other layers are parented how they should be. So the head needs to go up to this torso layer. The skateboard, we can parent that right to the left hand, so I'll parent it there. And then let's grab all of the Rubberhose controllers. So they're all labeled with an orange label. I'm gonna select that label and say select label group, and then just move them all to the top of the layer stack. And now I wanna isolate the shoulders and the hips. So I'm gonna grab those layers like that and drag them down below the ankles and wrists. These are the attach points for the 4 limbs to the torso. So I wanna parent these to that torso layer. So there we go, those are now parented. I can even just turn them off. I don't need to see them anymore because I don't want to manipulate them. But now if I move my torso, everything connected to it moves with it. So we're already on our way to having this character rig finished, but we just have a few more controls that I'd like to add. So let's start with the torso. I'm gonna select the layer and come over to Void. This is a freebie from BattleAxe. You do not have to use Void in order to do what I'm doing here, but it just makes it so much quicker. What I wanna do is make sure, one, that the anchor point is right where it needs to be, down here at the hips, so that the torso rotates around that correct point. And then I'm going to just click on the Void button. If I do that, it's going to generate a shape layer version of a null object, basically. So you could just make a null object and place it in the exact same place as that anchor point, but this is doing it for me. And not only has it done that, but it's also parented the torso to that layer for me. So with one click, I was able to do 3 or 4 steps all at once. And now if I move that to the top of my layer stack and move this around, I have a controller layer for the torso, which drives everything that's parented to it. But I also have some handy controls. Since this is Void, I can make this maybe a little bit bigger. I'll say 300 by 300, round it off a little bit, give it some style. I'm gonna increase the stroke up to say 10, and I don't really want dashes on this controller, so I'll just go into the contents, stroke, and remove those dashes. And why don't we change the color to be something a little bit more fun? We'll just say purple. Okay, so now I've got a torso controller over here, so it's not over top of my artwork. I can just easily grab it off to the side. I could even push it out to the side a little bit more. That's why it gives so much room around my character artwork in my compositions here, so that the controls can live off to the side and be easy to access. Let's do the same thing for the head. I'm just gonna select that layer, click the Void button. It's going to generate that void. I'll move it to the top. Void head, and let's just copy the contents of this void and paste it onto that one. And we'll copy the effects of this layer as well. We'll just copy and paste. Now we have the exact same styled control for the head as we do for the body. I'm just gonna make this one 200 by 200 instead of 300, and I can now do things like rotate this one around, rotate this one. Both of those layers aren't rigged up with Rubberhose, but I now have controllers for them. Now let's move on to the toes. If I rotate these layers around, actually I forgot to move that anchor point. That should be right about there. But I can rotate this around to get kind of a toe roll action on the foot. But I don't want to have a separate controller just for that feature. Instead, I'd like to be able to control that right on the Rubberhose controller. So what I'm going to do is search for the angle control effect. This is just an expression control. It just gives us an angle value that I can now tie the rotation of this layer to. So I'll press R to isolate the rotation of that layer. I'll click on the controller so I can see it in my effects controls, and then grab my expression pick whip, the property pick whip, and select the angle control value. And now that value is going to drive the rotation of my toes. So there we go. Let's rename this toes, and then I'll copy and paste it over to this foot's controller as well. Bring up the rotation for that layer, use my property pick whip to grab that toes angle control, and now I've built in a secondary level of control on a single controller, just simplifying things, condensing them, making it easier to work with. I think those are all the custom controls that I need. What I want to do now is just clean up my composition so I don't have to look at 42 layers every time I want to change something. And first things first, I'm going to select all of my artwork layers. So I'll again click on the label color for the artwork, select label group, and lock all of those layers. So now I can't click and drag any of these around, just the controllers that are visible. All of the behind the scenes stuff for rigging, like the bones and the hoses, those are all hidden already. What I want to do next is shy all of these layers and turn on the shy switch. But I actually used ChatGPT to create a scriptlet that I've installed into K-Bar that can do this for us. Now, you don't have to have K-Bar to run this script. You could put it in your scripts menu and go up to File, Scripts, and run it right here. But I would highly recommend that you look into K-Bar. It's such a time saver. You can download these scriptlets or a K-Bar file that you can import into your K-Bar to get this button. But what it does is shies locked layers, or if you hold Alt, it will shy and lock hidden layers, or if you hold Shift, it will lock shied layers. So lots of options there, but first I'm just gonna click on shy locked layers. The shy switch is enabled for all of those, but then I have some hidden layers here. So I'm gonna hold Alt, the icon will switch, and I'll say shy and lock hidden layers. And now everything that's not a controller has been locked and shied. And I can click on the shy switch and I'm left with just these controller layers, and it's way easier to navigate my timeline. I'm just gonna change some of these labels. So I'm gonna call this head controller. I'm gonna call this torso controller. And then I'm gonna change the labels of these as well. And I'm gonna put my hands above the torso and the head, the feet down below here. And why don't we just change the label color of all these to something more fun, like, I don't know, fuchsia. Now, normally I would create my character artwork in a more neutral pose. But in this case, I just created it in this kind of walk cycle pose. What I wanna do is reposition the controllers so that it is in a neutral pose, and so that the limbs are kind of just pointed straight down. They're pretty much extended, not really stretching, but just so that this leg is pointed down, and we get that stretch feedback right there. The controller color changes as soon as it gets to the stretch state. So I'm just gonna bump it up a little bit before it's completely extended. So drop this foot down, and you can see the extreme difference in limb length just based on those two legs there, but that's totally fine. I'm gonna pop these two layers up a little bit so they're not extended out. That looks good, and I'm seeing that this hip is really jutting out forward. So actually, let me unshy these layers and we'll find that right leg upper. Actually, let's just take a look at the hip controller. Maybe that's the culprit. I'm gonna turn that layer on, and sure enough, yeah, it just needs to be pushed back a little bit further so it's not sticking out forward like that. So that's all I needed to do. I'll lock that, turn the visibility back off, and shy my layers again. But this is basically the neutral state of my character. Now that we have this neutral state, I wanna make it very easy to get back to this neutral state. And if I expose all of the position properties by pressing P, it's going to show you that there's just a bunch of non-round values. There's no way I'm gonna remember any of these numbers if I ever wanted to get back to this neutral position. But this is where void comes back into play, which, by the way, we have K-Bar buttons for. So if you have K-Bar, you don't even have to have this panel open. The function that I'm after is 0 selected layers. If I select all of these layers and I go over to void, I could do the same thing by holding down Alt or Option on a Mac and clicking on this button. But since it's on K-Bar, I'm just gonna click on that. And what it's going to do is create void objects in the same position, scale, and rotation as the selected layers, and then wherever they are in the parent chain, insert themselves as the parent directly above that layer, which effectively zeroes out the position value, the scale goes to 100%, and the rotation goes to 0. None of my layers were rotated, so that's preserved, but the beauty of this is that now I can move my character's limbs around wherever I want. I can pose this however I want, move this stuff around, rotate it, and all I have to do to get back to my neutral position is select all of those controllers, zero out the X and Y position, zero out the rotation, and it's back to that neutral position. And that is just an incredibly useful feature of Void, something that I requested Adam put in, and I use it absolutely all the time. So again, go to battleaxe.co, you can download Void for free, as well as the K-bar buttons. One last thing I like to do is restrict properties that don't need to be modified. So for example, if I click and drag the head controller around, the head's gonna move with it, and I don't actually wanna be able to move the position of that layer or scale it up and down. So what I'm gonna do is expose the position by pressing P and holding Shift and pressing S to also expose the scale. And I'm gonna add a simple expression on both of these properties. So for the position, it's now 0, 0 because of the parent relationship to the void layer. I'm gonna Alt or Option click on that, and I'm gonna zoom in here so we can see this clearly, and I'm just gonna get rid of that and type in an open square bracket, and then the same values that we see right here, which are 0, 0, closing square bracket, semicolon. So what I'm telling this expression is make this value 0 on the X, 0 on the Y, and no matter what I do now, I can't move that around, the expression is going to override it. We'll do the same thing for the scale. Alt or Option click on it, open square bracket, and I'm gonna say 100, 100 for percent. I want 100% scale on both X and Y. Finish that off with a semicolon, click off, and now I can't accidentally scale this. It's always gonna be 100% scale. And with that, I've really locked up my rig here. This is all ready to go. I could hand it off to another animator or start animating with it myself. I do suggest that you keep your backup of this rig in this state though, so I'm just gonna duplicate this, drag it out of that folder. We can rename this whatever we need it to be, and then get to work animating. But that's how simple it is to rig up a character using Rubberhose 3's RubberRig system. Leave me a comment down below. Let me know if you like this video, what other features of Rubberhose you'd like to know more about. And if you use Rubberhose 3 and share any work, be sure to tag battleaxe.co as well as me at Jake in Motion. Thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you have a fantastic day, and I'll see you in the next one.